poultry and beef, and he's the joint founder of Regeneration Earth.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to the South of England Show Winter Conference. Some of you have heard from me before when in the past I presented my Nuffield findings a couple of years ago under very different circumstances. And I'm eternally grateful for the South of England Show Society for sponsoring me on my Nuffield journey, where my desire to work towards a regenerative future began. I've always been interested in designing a business that worked with nature rather than against it, not organic necessarily, but certainly not a comfortable with the word sustainable, now so more than ever. To my mind, sustainable is not really, and is no longer good enough, and attention should be focused on, building resilient and regenerative food and planetary systems. I personally feel that the word sustainable should now be taxed, and judging by the way politicians throw the word around, a small tax each time it's used could help the UK economy out of a bit of a fix. You won't hear me use it again, and I'll be around with a tin after this. Our farm was a fairly traditional family farming business when I joined 30 years ago, and like all youngsters, I started chopping and changing for what I thought at the time was for the best. Specialism, efficiency and intensification were the watchwords, and I followed the herd by actually getting rid of our herds and our sheep and focusing on arable and egg production. We grew the poultry business into something quite significant that on paper was going to pay bank debt and provide an opportunity to reinvest and build something quite special. I had a plan and was on a mission, but I hadn't factored in something that happened to our business sort of between 2017 and 2019 that was pretty savage. And although the events were out of our control, it was kind of time to reassess the direction that we were heading. Cattle and sheep are now back in the rotation, cover crops and forage crops are grown, and we're planning, rather like Tim, on moving our free-range hens into small mobile units into the arable rotation. Alongside rethinking our whole farming business model, I'd been incubating an idea for sort of the previous 5 years, pretty well since I started my Nuffield journey in 2015. And a meeting of minds has led to the launch of a new business. Regeneration Earth has been established to act as a conduit between businesses and individuals who want to and increasingly have to do something about their greenhouse gas emissions and effect on biodiversity loss, and those farmers and landowners who have the ability to do something about it. Somewhat inspired by the French initiative, the 4 per meal initiative introduced at COP21, Paris climate talks, where a group of scientists calculated that if the whole of the planet's soils could increase its organic matter by 0.4% per year, it could have the effect of absorbing all anthropological CO2 emissions. Now, it's well worth researching. I would urge everyone to have a look at it. And if you're feeling a bit lazy and just want to watch the telly, it's quite neatly encapsulated in a Netflix film called Kiss the Ground. I get a little fed up when I hear our politicians talking about the UK leading the world in technological solutions to climate change, when actually the answers are simple and quite literally lying beneath our feet. Natural solutions that Mother Nature has employed for millions of years. Soils not only have the ability to sequester massive tonnages of CO2, but they actually perform considerably better when organic matter levels increase, with the ability to hold more water, more nutrients, and host greater levels of soil microbiome. That very much underestimated, undervalued, and largely misunderstood ecosystem that's key to soil, plant, and human health. Now, every farmer can participate in regenerative agriculture. There's no strict rule book, but a suite of things that farmers can do. Not every farmer will be able to do everything, but all farms can do something. The basic principles are well known, with the main cornerstones being disturbing soils less, always having something growing on the ground, introduce a diversity of plant species, introduce livestock if possible, and reduce or at least optimize the use of artificial inputs. So when should the UK industry make a start? Well, the Japanese have a fantastic saying. The best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is now. And the sooner we all adapt our farming practices, the sooner we can help be part of the solution. So where do I think that farmers fit into UK's net zero ambitions? Well, in our view, it's simple. The UK farmers and landowners should actually form the backbone of the strategy. My farm is already sequestering about 4,000 tonnes of CO2 per year more than it emits. And there'll be plenty of people who are listening to this who are doing better than that without necessarily knowing it. And with a carbon credit value of, in the region of 20 quid a tonne, that represents quite a significant cash opportunity to every farmer. But of course, the first thing we need to do before we're able to benefit from a developing carbon market is to calculate where your emissions are now. And once you know where those emissions are, you need to think about how you can improve on that to get yourself to net zero, and then to be in a position to become a net sequester to give yourself something to market. Now, there are tools to enable you to help measure your carbon in your business, but it really isn't easy, as Tim's already alluded to. As an industry, we need to improve our messaging to consumers to ensure that they understand what regenerative agriculture is and its role in helping to reverse man-made climate change. If we can move most of UK agriculture towards regenerative practices, using both the carrot of commercial incentives and the stick where farms are unwilling to adapt, not only will we have a more resilient food system, but we'll have a fantastic marketing message. The large multiple retailers should be working with suppliers, in my view, to see how their systems can adapt and help them improve their planetary footprint. The biggest impact UK retailers can have on the move to net zero is to reduce food waste, is to help to reduce food waste. Food waste in the UK pretty much happens at the domestic level, and it happens because food isn't valued. And people have to get their heads around what food waste actually is. It's not just the food that's wasted, it's the resources that we use to produce that food, from the land, the agrochemicals, the animal feed, the cultivation, the transport costs, refrigeration, a journey home, the fridge at home, and then the cost of chucking it in landfill at the end for the food that doesn't make it into a digester. For political reasons, successive UK governments have followed a cheap food policy, which on the face of it sounds great. And the UK has one of the lowest consumer food costs in the world, produced, I might add, to some of the highest standards. Yet we have amongst the highest levels of obesity, which has a crippling effect on the NHS. We have cheap food, but UK levels of external costs of that food system are very high. It's appropriate to remind everybody at this point that actually cheap food does cost the earth. One of the other issues we're faced with in the industry is the use of artificial agchems and fertilizers. And we need a response from manufacturers and suppliers. We know that inputs can antagonize soil biology. What we don't know is really by how much and which chemicals are having the greatest impact. The agchem supply industry, in my opinion, needs to get a grip of this, to do the work and be open with the findings. I can see some of these companies completely pivoting their businesses in the next 10 years or so to a position where they rely less on margins made on chemicals and fertilizers and actually become advocates for soil health and rebuild their businesses with that as their primary goal. So one of the biggest obstacles we have at the moment is who's going to pay for all this carbon that we're going to sequester? Because there's a real opportunity to do so, because the market doesn't really exist at the moment, not formally at least. There are lots of informal ones, and there are lots of informal markets where you can offset your flight to the Canary Islands, but some of those rely on dubious planting schemes in Africa, where the results are very hard to verify, and in some cases have had an incredibly negative impact on local land and people. If a carbon market doesn't exist and farmers are not incentivized to raise organic matter levels, they won't naturally do it, as building soil takes time and commitment. It's unlikely to happen on short-term tenancies or contract farms unless a landowner is motivated to participate in the journey of regenerative agriculture. So at Regeneration Earth, we're looking at models that rely on verification of carbon every 3 to 5 years and paying farmers based on the actual carbon captured. And that simply doesn't work on short-term FBTs. So how radical do we have to be in the UK? Well, I think it's time that we had a good look at where and how intensive livestock is produced. There's currently a problem, for instance, in the Wye and Usk river valleys, where there's been an intensification of free-range egg production within those river catchments. And this has coincided with an increased water eutrophication events. And thus the chickens are copping the blame. Whether they are or not is yet to be proven. But one fact that is inescapable, however, is that there are huge amounts of nutrient being produced in an area that cannot utilise them properly. And maybe we should be looking at further large-scale animal agriculture should be targeted, or growth in animal agriculture should be targeted at the arable producing areas that can fully utilise the nutrients it produces. Maybe we should look to remodel the entire livestock industry. It's one of hot debate. But the problem is, of course, is that consumers have become accustomed to cheap chicken and eggs and have no idea of what that true external cost of cheap chicken is. I don't often find myself agreeing with George Monbiot, but on this particular point I do. And maybe we should be reconsidering some of the farming practices that occur in the mountains and dales. The landscapes of these areas have been shaped by agriculture over the last 200 to 300 years. Before then, it was very different to what it is now. Although beautiful, I do feel that these systems of agriculture on these delicate landscapes are probably doing more harm than good. Sheep farming in the hills is hard and unprofitable for most. And there are, of course, exceptions, but the majority rely on subsidy to survive. I simply pose the question, would those areas not be best suited to woodland regeneration, tourism and wildlife, and bringing the livestock into lowland arable rotations where they could fit very much into a regenerative agricultural system? There is a significant opportunity in the UK to build a domestic timber industry that displaces imports from abroad. Currently, the UK imports 80% of its timber requirements from all over the world. The UK government has a plan to plant 30,000 hectares per year of trees to help on our way to net zero. There is an exciting opportunity to benefit from new income streams from timber, carbon and biodiversity sales. At Regeneration Earth, we're working with a novel sterile hybrid clone of the Paulonia hardwood that grows at an unparalleled speed, maturing to harvestable size in 8 to 10 years, rather than the 30 to 40 years for softwood pine species. Paulonia timber is often referred to as the aluminium of the timber trade, of the timber world, has a bright future ahead. We're planning on growing it in both afforestation, full afforestation, and in agroforestry systems on our farm and promoting it throughout the farming industry. Cambridge University are currently researching the construction of wooden tower blocks, and Google are doing the same with wooden cities. Both have identified the opportunity to lock away carbon for generations in buildings. The production of that timber is an opportunity for UK agriculture to fulfill the demand. It's simple. Make trees commercial and they will be grown. To conclude my slot, farms are very much part of the future of a net zero UK, not just a UK farming industry net zero, but the net zero ambitions of the UK as a whole. We should lobby policymakers for recognition of what we can achieve and be the leaders, quite literally, in this field. CO2 sequestration into organic matter, into soil organic matter rather, and timber, in our view, are the most obvious, natural and low-cost solutions to anthropological climate change. We do need to think differently throughout the supply chain and enact positive change. We need to reject sustainable and make a paradigm shift from soil exploitation to soil regeneration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Loads of questions coming in, so I'm going to whip through them. Some people were very impressed with your figures. David Jones wants to know, for a start, how do you measure your carbon?
Okay, so this keeps cropping up. So It's very difficult to, so in the soil now, we've taken a benchmark measurement using a DOMAS method of measuring the amount of organic matter in our soil. There are recognized metrics. We know the yield, where we're incorporating cover crops, and we grow a crop called lucerne, some know it as alfalfa, where we grow it specifically for carbon sequestration. We know the yield of that. We know the dry matter yield of that. Divide that by 2, that gives you the amount of carbon that you are sequestering into that soil, and then you have to take off the losses through cultivation.
Christine says, what's the best programme to inform us of how near each individual farm is to net zero? Now, I'm assuming she's talking about your own farm, not nosing at the neighbours, although she might be wanting to know for everybody. But how do you start that on a farm?
So we've used a couple of models. One is the farm carbon calculator that's available to everybody online. That was where I started, and then I've used a university model which I've not actually allowed to share at this stage.
Malcolm Triggs raises this issue. He says target culture in areas such as education as crime has left the public rather cynical about the validity of figures quoted, and points out that Tim May seems to share some of this cynicism, and suggested that one way of agriculture meeting net zero is actually to manipulate the figures. So how do you ensure that doesn't happen, and indeed then convince the consumer that net zero means what it says?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, we're looking at verification of carbon. We're not sure whether it's going to be every 3 or 5 years, but really remeasuring actual organic matter in soils. So and then incentivize or paying farmers they'll get a payment to start with, and then a top-up payment for the actual carbon sequestered.
I'm sure we are looking for
there is no silver bullet here. We're doing our best to come up with the most sensible and the most defendable system we can. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll come back to this with the full panel. Just one quick one from David Exwood. What's the first thing every farmer can do to move towards net zero?
Oh, crikey. Well, certainly introduce more legumes into your cover cropping, min-till, reduce nitrogen. There you go.
Doug, thank you very much. We'll catch up with you at the end. Let's hear from our last speaker. Hugh Martineau is Head of Sustainability at Map of Ag. He has been advising